What is up, guys? Welcome back to the third video in this series going over what the Arrowverse would have looked like if it was structured more like the MCU or the Arrow Cinematic Universe. I already went over Phase 1 and Phase 2. You could check out those videos in the cards at the top right corner of this one. But now we're going to be going over Phase 3, which is significantly longer than the first two phases. It is nearly double the amount of movies. The first two had 6 each. This phase has 11 movies, which means this video is going to be a lot longer than those first two videos because there's a lot to talk about and there's a lot more movies. With that in mind, let's get right into it, starting with the first MCU movie of Phase 3, Captain America Civil War, which is a bit of a tricky scenario because this movie is a Captain America movie, but it's also kind of an Avengers movie, which means that in this context, it would have to be either a Supergirl movie or a crossover, and I'm leaning a little bit more towards the crossover, but that's a problem because that means Supergirl doesn't get a third movie. So the crossover I had in mind to replace Captain America Civil War is Elseworlds. It is the crossover right before In Crisis on Infinite Earths. Civil War is technically the last Avengers movie before Infinity War, so it does have that in common. Aside from that, there isn't really much, aside from the fact that it is a little bit of a scaled-down Justice League movie, much like Civil War was a bit of a scaled-down Avengers movie without certain key players like Thor and Hulk. Elseworlds doesn't have at least the legends, so Elseworlds would be replacing Civil War with some minor differences. Specifically, because there's no Supergirl movie, we can make this a Supergirl movie, like maybe call it Supergirl Elseworlds, and make her the main character instead of Oliver and Barry being the main characters and Supergirl is behind them. It could be like maybe the other way around. I don't know if that would be as fun as a crossover, but I also am replacing a Captain America movie, not an Avengers movie, so it's a little bit of a tricky scenario, like I said earlier. So the crossover itself wouldn't really have that many changes, but there are certain things that would be changed by the fact that there are seasons that were skipped, or storylines that we couldn't really get to yet. So because The Flash Season 5 was skipped, for one, Barry never gets a Season 5 costume, which means that he either has a Season 4 costume, which is way better anyway, or his Season 6 costume, which is also much better anyway, which is the costume that he was wearing during this crossover. He and Oliver were both wearing his Season 5 costume, the second one. Instead, he would just have the much better costumes from Seasons 4 or 6. There's also the ending of Season 5, which changed the events of the Crisis from 2024 to 2019. This crossover would do that instead because The Flash Season 5 just never happened. And also, it wouldn't be 2019, it would be 2018 because that's the year that Infinity War came out. And that's basically, replacing things here. It doesn't really matter all that much, but that is a change, a slight change that might happen in this universe. There's Arrow Season 6 that never happened, so Oliver's identity isn't revealed and he never went to prison. Very minor changes. It doesn't really affect the crossover that much, but that does in the Season 7 lead into the episode before the crossover, which deals with Oliver and Felicity having their relationship problems, which also bleeds into the crossover, which is something that never happens in this version of the universe. So because in Phase 2, I made it so that the main villain of the Ray, was not the villains from the show. It was a new villain, the villain from the comics, who is the real Führer of Earth X, Overman. That would make it so that if we see another evil version of Superman in Elseworlds, it would be pretty repetitive. The same reason why we didn't see an evil version of Barry Allen in Crisis on Earth X in the original one, because we just saw Savitar. So because of that, John Deegan never becomes Superman, which he never really needed to anyway, and instead just becomes the regular version of Dr. Destiny from the comics, which is what he was going to become in the end, which is what he did become in the end, and that's something that I wanted to see more of, the actual comic book villain Dr. Destiny, which is what the character is based off of. Aside from that, there are other minor details like, along with Oliver and Barry and also Kara, John and Clark are also part of the Elseworlds test, because in Season 5, in Season 5 of Supergirl, that's not a thing that ever happens. John wouldn't really be able to be tested for the Crisis because he couldn't have the Malefic storyline, so instead he is a part of this Elseworlds test, along with every other main hero from Earth 38, because, that is a slight change that it will make to this. The Monitor is not just testing Earth 1 here, he's also testing Earth 38 at the same time, so that I think is an easy way to make Supergirl more of an important character, because, like I said, she's not getting another movie, so it might as well make it here, where she is a more important character than how she was in the original Elseworlds. So next up is Doctor Strange, and much like Ant-Man, there isn't really a good replacement in the Arrowverse. The best I could come up with is, much like Ant-Man, using a CW seed show and replacing Doctor Strange with Vixen. Now, there isn't really much of a connection here at all. Like, I didn't really find much. I mean, other than the fact that, Vixen kind of has a little bit of a magical background, or her powers do, so there is that. But other than that, there isn't really any other franchise to replace Doctor Strange with, so I'm just going to be going with Vixen. The actual season would be very similar to the one we saw, just a lot longer and a lot more things added in. However, one thing that's taken out is the appearances of Green Arrow and the Flash. They just had their Elseworlds movie. There isn't really any room for them to be in this one as well, and Vixen would stand more on her own. However, I think that this would definitely have a lot of differences, or it would make a lot of differences to things like Legends of Tomorrow Season 2, where it just wouldn't make any sense for Amaya Jiwe to appear there, but it also wouldn't make sense for Mari to appear there either, so Vixen just wouldn't be a part of that movie. But also, Vixen herself would have a larger role in the Arrowverse, because Doctor Strange did have a fairly large role in the MCU, so I'm not going to really go over anything other than that for Vixen and replacing Doctor Strange, but I will probably talk about Vixen a little bit more in other movies. So next up is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 and its replacement, Legends of Tomorrow 2, which I'm calling the movie The Legends of Doom. The first one is called Legends of Tomorrow, and I don't want to call this one Legends of Tomorrow Legion of Doom or something. I think it's a clever idea to just replace the last word in each Legends of Tomorrow movie with a thing that connects to the movie. So this time around, the movie would be called The Legends of Doom, and it would obviously be based off Legends of Tomorrow Season 2, which is arguably the best season of the show, and certainly the one that's the most interesting. We have all these other villains from the Arrowverse, like the Reverse Flash and the rest of the Legion of Doom. We also have the JSA, and by far the best roster for the Legends that we've ever seen. So I think that this has the potential to be a really good movie, with some minor changes from the original season. So let's go over the changes that I would have made to Legends of Tomorrow Season 2 if it would be in this context, in this structure. None of these changes stem from the fact that we skipped a season, because we didn't skip a season. We went from Season 1 to 2. All of the changes stem from 1. We aren't going to be getting a Season 3 or 4, so there are certain events from those seasons that would happen here instead. But also, this movie takes place in a much later point in the Arrowverse, so that does cause some changes. But also, there's one big change that happens because we didn't get that third Supergirl movie, and because we never saw Supergirl Season 4, which I will get to in a bit. So the first big change has to do with Firestorm, something that I feel like I've said a lot in these videos. I don't know, Firestorm's storyline has changed probably more than any other character, or at least any other character that still exists. Anyway, Firestorm, or Ronnie Raymond at least, was Firestorm for a lot longer than he was in the original Arrowverse, and he died instead of Martin Stein in Crisis on Earth X. And now Jefferson Jackson is becoming Firestorm a little bit later than he was in the original Arrowverse. I mean, a lot later time-wise, not that much later seasons-wise in terms of Legends of Tomorrow. I mean, it only missed one season, which was the first one. But anyway, the movie, it basically starts with Jefferson Jackson replacing Ronnie Raymond, along with Martin Stein, as the new Firestorm. So like I said, Amaya Jiwe wouldn't appear in this movie because, it just wouldn't work with the Vixen movie just coming out. Vixen has her own franchise. It just wouldn't make any sense for Vixen to appear here. And I think the JSA would just be involved in the story in a different way to the way that they were here. Because Season 3 never happens, I think that John Constantine should join the Legends here instead of in that season, or even in Season 4. And Rip Hunter would die at the end of this movie because Season 3, again, never happens. There are certain things that are different about the Legion of Doom. So first of all, Reverse Flash's storyline is very, very similar. However, there's one key difference that I would make that not only would make everything make more sense, but also would bring back a storyline, or bring up a storyline that is very interesting that we wouldn't really get another chance to see in this universe. The negative Speed Force storyline that we would see in The Flash Season 5. Again, because The Flash Season 5 never happens, we would see here instead. They would use the negative Speed Force to explain Eobard's timeline. He comes from the ending of The Flash Season 1, where he gets erased from existence, or The Flash, the movie, where he gets erased from existence. However, he didn't get erased from existence because he took refuge in the negative Speed Force, and then when he escaped the Speed Force, the Black Flash started racing after him. That would be his storyline, that would be his timeline in this movie, which is a little bit less convoluted than the one we actually got in Legends of Tomorrow Season 2. This would be the main follow-up to his storyline from The Flash, and again, because we don't see The Flash Season 5, this would be where we see the introduction to the negative Speed Force and that whole element of the Reverse Flash. In terms of the other members, Malcolm Merlyn would be from before the events of Arrow Season 1, because in those events he dies, and he fully dies, and we never see him again, so he would be maybe from right before those events, where in the end of this movie he gets his memory erased and put right back to where he was. Damien Darhk debuts here because we never got to see Arrow Season 4, so this would be his debut. This would be the first time we see him, not as a main villain, but as a villain nonetheless. And finally, there would be maybe other members that we would see on this team. Those members being Captain Cold, Heatwave, Gorilla Grodd, and Lex Luthor. Captain Cold and Heatwave were members of the Legion of Doom, but the problem here was that Heatwave betrayed the Legends and then joined the Legion, and then betrayed the Legion and joined the Legends. I don't really think that's necessary, and I don't really see there being a storyline for Heatwave going on beyond this movie, so I would just make it so that he joins the Legion of Doom and stays a member of the Legion of Doom, along with the pre-Legends of Tomorrow version of Captain Cold. Captain Cold's memory is erased by the end of the movie, and he gets placed back where he was, and Heatwave maybe even dies sacrificing himself, much like Captain Cold died in the first Legends of Tomorrow movie, so that's the way he betrays the Legion of Doom, because the way he did it in the actual season just doesn't make any sense that the Legends would still trust him. Then there's Gorilla Grodd, who I would make a member of this team because he was a member of Mullis' team in Season 3, and we don't get to see that because Season 3 is not something that exists ever, and we don't really get to see much of Grodd in this universe, so place him here in the Legion of Doom, a team that he's a very, very prominent member of in the comics. Speaking of prominent members of the Legion of Doom, there's also Lex Luthor. This is what I meant when I said that not getting Supergirl Season 4 affects this movie. Because we don't get that season, we never get the introduction to Lex Luthor, a character that is instrumental in the Crisis on Infinite Earths storyline, or the crossover itself. I mean, he's one of the only remaining characters who survives in the end, and while I don't necessarily think I would keep that the same way, we do still need Lex Luthor in there. We also need Lex Luthor to be introduced before that. Plus, he's an awesome villain, so why not use him? I'm contemplating making an extra movie for Supergirl so that she would have that, and she would have that storyline, and Lex Luthor would be introduced. A movie that would come out after Elseworlds, but I didn't do that because I wanted to stay true to the MCU structure and not add another movie, so instead, Lex Luthor would be one of the villains in this movie. Not the main villain, because Reverse Flash is the main character in that storyline, but maybe he could be a co-main villain with the Reverse Flash, and maybe they would even come head-to-head in the end. But Lex Luthor is a great villain. He is usually the leader of the Legion of Doom in the comics, and he wasn't a member of this version of Legion of Doom, and I think that if this was a movie universe, they would have a lot more say in that. They would have a lot more likelihood of using Lex Luthor. I know he lives in a different universe, but I don't think it would be really all that difficult to make Lex Luthor have some sort of universe-traveling device. The episodes this season would focus on are the Justice Society of America, the Legion of Doom, Fellowship of the Spear, Doom World, as well as Aruba, with obviously a whole bunch of Lex Luthor sprinkled in there. There are slight other differences, like the Legends don't break time in the end, because obviously Season 3 doesn't happen, so there's no time to deal with that, and maybe the JSA's roster is a little bit more expanded upon, and a little bit more similar to the roster we see on Stargirl, which I'll get to a little bit later. Next up is SpiderMan Homecoming. Now, this would have to be a new franchise, and the Spider-Man franchise will be a new franchise. It will be a different TV show, but not quite yet. Spider-Man Homecoming, this is where I deviate a little bit from the formula I've given myself up until this point, because while Supergirl can get away with not having another season, because I mean the only real thing they needed from that season was to introduce Lex Luthor, and they could have done that in a different way, I do think that Arrow needs at least one more movie, because Season 8 is a season that absolutely needs to happen, and I think this is the best opportunity to do so, because while Spider-Man Homecoming is technically a new franchise, it is the closest thing to an Iron Man sequel that we got since Iron Man 3. He is a very, very large part of this movie. I mean, the main villain's motivation is more against Tony Stark than it is against Peter Parker. That is clear, and I think that it would make sense for this structure to replace this with a Green Arrow movie instead of a new franchise. But like I said, the next Spider-Man movie will be a new franchise and a new TV show. But this will be Green Arrow based off of Season 8. I will name it Green Arrow Crisis Quest. And the episodes we will focus on are basically every episode: Starling City, Welcome to Hong Kong, A Leap of Faith, Present Tense, Reset, and Purgatory, which only skips one episode, the episode where they go to Russia, because the last Green Arrow movie went to Russia a pretty large amount. We don't really need to see more of that in this one. So obviously we skipped a couple seasons. We skipped seasons 6 and 7, and also there would be changes to season 8. So skipping season 6 means that Oliver's identity is never revealed and he never goes to prison, which is something that I mentioned for Elseworlds, but it is obviously, in fact, a lot more important for this movie. The Team Arrow Civil War never happens, which would be a lot more scaled down if it did happen, because characters of Wild Dog, Mr. Terrific, the Second Black Canary, and more just don't exist. Oliver never faced off against Ricardo Diaz, at least on screen. They couldn't make it so that he did face off against Ricardo Diaz off screen, or maybe he's a villain that we see a little bit in the beginning of this movie, which, it's possible. It doesn't really matter. Arrow Season 7 never happening means that Bronze Tiger never gets a redemption arc. Oliver never faced off against Emiko, and Emiko is not a character that ever exists, and neither are the Ninth Circle, which brings us to Season 8. So that brings me to the changes to Season 8, the biggest of which has to do with who I think is the second main character of the season, Laurel. I love seeing Oliver and Laurel team up so much in this season. However, this time around, or at least in this movie, it would be a little bit different. Like I said earlier in Phase 2 of this video, Earth 2 Laurel is not a character that exists, or at least not a character that is of such significance, because Earth 1 Laurel never died. She stayed Black Canary, and she has been Black Canary since the very beginning, so the storylines would be a little bit different. It's not her that reacts to the destruction of Earth 2, because she's not from Earth 2. Instead, it's a character from Earth 2 brought into the season, which would be Adrian Chase. The Earth 2 version of Adrian Chase would not be Green Arrow, because it would be a little bit weird having two versions of Green Arrow in this season. Instead, he would be Vigilante, and he would be, the new Vigilante, also now a member of Team Arrow, but also the character that reacts to the destruction of Earth 2 above anyone else. Laurel had a sort of Elseworlds test in Arrow Season 8, which didn't make any sense for the Crisis, because she didn't end up appearing in the Crisis at all. This time around she will, and this time around she will have a very big role, but her Elseworlds test, her test, would have to be a little bit different. Her test in Arrow Season 8 had to do with the Monitor promising that he can bring back Earth 2. This time around it would be a little different. Instead, this time around he can bring back Quentin Lance, who, I should have said this earlier, because Arrow Season 6 never happened, he didn't die there. Instead, he died in the Lian-Yu explosion, and Laurel has been obviously mourning his death ever since. This is also something that would come up in the second Legends of Tomorrow movie, or actually both the Legends of Tomorrow movies, which both take place after Arrow Season 5, or Green Arrow: The Vengeance. One last thing is that the whole storyline from Season 7 where Diggle meets his stepfather and then maybe kind of becomes Jon Stewart, that would happen here instead, because again, Season 7 never happened. That's really it for Arrow Season 8, so let's move on to the next movie, Thor Ragnarok. And the movie replacing Thor Ragnarok would be The Flash Season 6A, which is the third great Flash season. Obviously, it's all the episodes, or most of the episodes, leading up to the Crisis in Season 6 of The Flash. The movie would be called The Flash: Blood of the Crisis, and would focus on the episodes Into the Void, A Flash of the Lightning, There Will Be Blood, as well as the two-part finale, The Last Temptation of Barry Allen, Part 1 and Part 2. So there was a pretty big gap between Thor: The Dark World and Thor Ragnarok, 4 years, and in those 4 years, there were 3 Flash seasons that we skipped, seasons 3, 4, and 5. We never skipped this such a large amount of seasons before, so there are a lot of things that never happened. Since Season 3 never happened, Barry never went through Flashpoint, he never saved his mother in Season 2, and then Flashpoint never happened, and neither did the consequences of Flashpoint, so Barry never faced off against Savitar never ended up killing HR, but also HR never appeared. So because The Flash Season 4 never happened, Wally never leaves, something that he did right at the beginning of Season 4. Because he never leaves, he's still around in Season 6, which it wouldn't really be difficult to add him to the storyline of the season. Elongated Man also never debuts, which is a shame, but there isn't really any room for him at this point. And Barry never faced off against the Thinker. The Flash Season 5 never happened, so that means, like I said, for Elseworlds, he never gets his Season 5 costume. He did get a Season 4 costume, despite that never happening, because I wanted him to, so I gave it to him. I gave it to him in Crisis on Earth X. Barry also never faced off against the Cicadas, or at least he never did in this context where they're the big bads, and XS never appears. She isn't a character that exists ever in this universe. The Reverse Flash storyline doesn't happen here. Instead, we get the introduction to the Negative Speed Force in Legends of Doom, the second Legend of Tomorrow movie. King Shark never gets a redemption arc, so he's still a villain. Sherlock also never appears, meaning that Nash Wells, who appears in this movie, is only the third Harrison Wells, or technically the fourth, after Earth 1 Harrison Wells, Eobard Thawne, Harry Wells, and now Nash. And also, Cisco never gives up his powers, so he is still a vibe once Crisis on Infinite Earths rolls around. Which brings us to Season 6, which doesn't really have all that many changes, aside from, I think, one episode being skipped, or 2 episodes being skipped in the beginning of the season, and also Kid Flash being around instead of Ralph. There isn't really any other changes to Season 6, because I think it was a pretty perfect setup for Crisis on Infinite Earths, which is also why I didn't really make that many changes to Arrow Season 8, other than the one that I had to, which is replacing Earth 2 Laurel with Earth 1 Laurel. Aside from that, I think both of these seasons did an incredible job of setting up the Crisis, and I think they would have worked very, very well as movies, and obviously this means that Bloodwork is the villain of this one. And that brings us to the final pre-Crisis or pre-Infinity War movie, but also the final movie I'm going to be going over in this video. There is going to be a part 2 to this video because, this video is already over 20 minutes. It's going to be way, way too long. The last movie is Black Panther, and, there's a pretty obvious replacement to this, Black Lightning. So the Black Lightning movie would take elements from all 3 seasons of Black Lightning, although it would be mostly based off of Season 3, which is, I think, by far the best season, with by far the best main villain. So the elements from Season 1 that would take is that Jefferson comes out of retirement, comes out of not being a vigilante for a very long time, because his daughters were kidnapped. It also takes Anissa becoming Thunder in this movie, and also from Season 2. The only thing it really takes from Season 2 is that Jennifer becomes Lightning. Along with that, it mostly is based off of Season 3, because like I said, it has the best villain. Gravedigger is way, way, way better than Tobias Whale or Martin Proctor from Season 1, but also because it has the most interesting storyline of Black Lightning bringing together the Outsiders. With this being the ACU and not just the Arrowverse, I think there's a lot more things they could do, especially with the Outsiders property and all the other members of the Outsiders that they had in the comics. So the season had Brandon Marshall instead of Brian Markov, who was clearly a counterpart of Geoforce. I don't think that they would have done that in the ACU. I think they just would have made him Brian Markov and easily used that character. Also, they could use Tatsu Yamashiro, a character who has yet to appear in this universe since Arrow Season 3 never happened, and while she could make her debut in the last Green Arrow movie, I think it would also make a lot of sense for her to make her debut here as a member of the Outsiders. You could also have maybe Metamorpho, not really Batman, I don't think that would fit as well, but there are plenty of Outsiders members that I would love to see on this version of the Black Lightning Outsiders team that we didn't really get in Black Lightning Season 3, but this movie would be mostly based off of that season with certain elements from the first 2, with not really much from Season 2 because, those first 2 seasons aren't great. So that's it for this video. Stay tuned for the second part of this video where I go over the last 5 movies in Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and what the ACU versions of those movies would look like. The movies are Avengers Infinity War, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Captain Marvel, Avengers Endgame, and Spider-Man Far From Home. Stay tuned for that, coming out probably not too long after this one, and as always, thanks for watching.